everyone. Thanks for joining us. This session is going to be on governance and establishing a center of excellence for digital transformation. My name is Jessica. I'll give you a quick introduction to myself and a little bit of my background and what I do at Tulip, and then more about the agenda and how we're going to spend the about hour that we have together. So, as I said, my name is Jessica. At Tulip, I lead the customer success team. So this encompasses most of the post-sales customer journey. My original background is in aerospace and defense manufacturing, all discrete, primarily metalworking, machine shop type environments. Spent a ton of time there doing partially production management and then mostly manufacturing quality engineering. Moved on from there, went into consulting, did lean transformations, large cost out projects, multi-site, largely cost out, but sometimes other initiatives to increase revenue type projects. So I've seen quite a few sites and a lot of different structures. And then I've been at Tulip going on 3.5, 4 years and have worked with a variety of our customers on how they can create sustainable and scalable programs to enable digital transformation with Tulip using that citizen developer concept that most of you have probably heard of if you've been looking at Tulip or speaking to folks about Tulip. So looking forward to jumping into that. Most of this presentation will be talking through some slides. There's an exercise that I'll make sure I want to leave about 10 minutes for that we'll do together. So I'll walk you through that and the slides will prompt that. And the thought behind that is hopefully you come out of here with some ideas on how you might structure your center of excellence and the next steps you would need to take to figure out how to get that started. So we're going to start with some of the theory, more of the framework part on governance and Tulip's deployment approach. This slide shows Tulip's adoption journey and our high-level deployment approach. We think of digital transformation in 3 main phases: explore, scale, and transform. I do always say if you want to Google digital transformation models, you'll get plenty of them. Tulip uses a 3-part transformation model, partially just because it's simpler and it helps us orient around this concept of exploring is when customers are still learning about the platform. Tulip, for those of you who are customers and have seen it, is quite different than most other software available for manufacturing, if not all the other software out there available for manufacturing operations, frontline operations spaces. So understanding the platform and its capabilities and what you can do with it, as well as what capabilities you need to enable and scale Tulip, is part of the explore phase. Scale up is execution, getting things going, deploying at more stations, lines, areas, use cases, and hopefully driving a lot more value with each of those use cases. If you're managing production, now you're getting into managing quality, maybe managing some of your inventory with Tulip. All of that should be different ways that you can drive value. And then transform is this state where your baseline for continuous improvement is digital. So you have your data being collected digitally, available in real time, and you're doing continuous improvement on your processes, maybe with the same basic lean principles in mind, but on a more digitized state. So that's just grounding for how we think about it. And I'll be referring to some of these terms on scale up and explore as we get into the Center of Excellence framework. So high level, I also like to share that governance encompasses a lot of topics. People throw out the word governance, and there's actually quite a few subtopics that they could be talking about. So I'll break that down in the next few slides. But it encompasses or can encompass both strategic and tactical topics for how you govern digital transformation. All right, so there's 4 main areas that we are going to cover when we talk about governance. The first one, strategy and objectives, may be obvious. It's high-level vision for what are we doing, an overall strategy as far as this, again, can vary by company, but what processes are you trying to improve? Are there key metrics that you're trying to get to at the business level? Is there a certain tech stack strategy that your company has in mind? These sorts of things are important to consider because they'll drive a lot of the other activities. The second area on here is the adoption program definition. I'll get to more about the term adoption program, but Tulip uses that instead of Center of Excellence because we want our customers to adopt Tulip as a tool that they can use to drive digital transformation. So the adoption program to roll out Tulip and be able to scale it up, degree of centralization, that refers to your company's centralization, roles, responsibilities, how you manage that. Program management, very tactical, how do you execute? There's a lot of project management, as anyone knows, with deploying change in the shop floor. Timelines, making sure people get everything, risks are managed, and you bring in a new machine, someone's talked to maintenance, somebody's talked to facilities, you've got all your dates lined up. So like that very tactical bit of how to drive change needs to be there. And then the last one on here is platform and content governance. Tulip, being a platform, does have flexibility, and most people are aware of that. So we will talk a bit about how you can think about managing that flexibility in a way that gives appropriate teams the control that they need or feel that they need, while also giving citizen developers space to build things and ideate and improve. So things like user management strategy, platform strategy. When I say that, for those more familiar with Tulip, there's this concept of instances, workspaces. What is the strategy behind that? How many sites, regions are combined in what workspaces and what instances, which gets to how is your data segregated? All of that goes into platform and content management, as well as managing app lifecycles themselves. So high level overview, but the intention is keep that in mind, and that governance can encompass multiple different topics, and we try to break them down so it's clear which one we're talking about. So with that in mind, you can also think of it as the organization is how you will scale and do digital transformation. It doesn't tell you what you're going to scale as far as Tulip-wise, use cases, apps, certain data, certain dashboards, but it will tell you how you're going to enable it. What processes do you need? What people, organization structures? The technical bit is what would you scale? This gets into use cases, apps. I mentioned data structures, certain dashboards. So there are those two sides to it. We are focused today on the how to scale portion. Center of Excellence and Adoption Program. Not going to read this slide to you. If you're here, you probably have heard the term Center of Excellence. There's just some grounding terms on here is what we talk about when we mean Center of Excellence. And the point is it's here to drive change. If you're doing business as usual, you don't need a Center of Excellence concept. The whole thought behind it is you're bringing together a group to help drive change. Tulip uses the term adoption program, and I mentioned this earlier, it includes a Center of Excellence, but it's this concept of how do you drive adoption of Tulip into your sites, into your workforce, into your ways of working as a means of doing continuous improvement, creating value for the business, digitizing. So you'll see adoption program on a lot of the other slides. One more theoretical slide before we get into an actual COE framework structure. So I'll explain. If you're looking at this slide, it goes from left to right, from a more decentralized organization to a more centralized organization. And hopefully folks are following me as far as some companies themselves are more centralized. They might have global reporting structures, shared services, and some companies are more decentralized. Every site makes decisions on their own. They have their own IT. There's no central IT. That part of it is company specific. So Tulip recommends a virtual center-led center of excellence, meaning the center of excellence or adoption program that you build does not have to have a firm reporting structure in that, say, every single site has a main Tulip champion and there's some central advanced manufacturing or ops excellence team. They don't have to report through that person, but there should be a way for those folks to stay in touch and have a community that's virtual. The centralized version of this, which we do have customer examples who have done this, is you have a purely reporting structure centralized team that maybe goes site to site and implements Tulip. A fully decentralized model would be every site, and I am talking primarily about multi-site, more enterprise transformations here. Every site has a couple folks that are focused on Tulip. They report through the site, and that's it. And maybe they are just connected through shared team channels, email chains, maybe a monthly forum group, but there's just no reporting structure. We recommend the middle, and this we'll get into more detail on that as far as what does that actually look like? What kind of roles do you need so that you'll have at least one person who's a central coordinator and then site level contacts. All right, we're going to cover a couple slides now that go over org structures and then what the different roles mean. So this slide is also similar to the last one laid out. Left-hand side is for a less centralized org structure. Right-hand side is for more centralized. And you'll note the primary difference is just in that middle band of orchestrate and coordinate, that there are just fewer roles if you're less centralized. Either way, given my last slide on, we recommend a virtual center-led, meaning there is still some level of central team member. There is still something, there are people in that middle row. So top row, sponsorship, pretty obvious. You need stakeholders, you need sponsors, and you need them to be cross-functional. digital transformation in manufacturing or operations, you're going to need operations stakeholders, usually IT, most likely quality or compliance to some extent. And then there may be others if you have different supply chain functions, procurement functions, whatever those are. Your middle layer there is that center of excellence centralization. Again, I'm using center of excellence and adoption program here a bit. I'm interchanging those terms. So for at the COE level, having a lead, someone who is responsible for Tulip as a product in the company, who can help liaison with Tulip, liaison with the different sites, if there are different sites, with the app builders, and who has oversight of the product as far as overall strategy. I mentioned platform strategy before, and can help connect folks, connect with the sponsorship team, and keep stakeholders informed. At the site level, we always recommend you have to have multiple people involved at the site level because, and you'll hear this if you've worked with any of the Tulip teams, the knowledge of the processes and what's needed for digital transformation is so deep within where it's actually happening. Like we preach a lot that operators know what's happening to a degree that really no one else does, the folks executing the process. So having your SMEs there, whether that's a process or manufacturing engineer, quality and compliance, certainly if depending on what use case we're deploying, they might be a really important stakeholder to have. Someone to play the app builder role in Tulip. An adoption manager plays a bit of a project manager role and a change agent role at the site. So that's across whether it's centralized or not. We want site level people involved. And then if you want to have a larger central program, you can have more roles. The next couple of slides actually explain some of what I was talking about as far as what do roles look like. I'm not going to read them to you in that at a high level, most of these roles probably make sense to folks. You need sponsorship. In the middle, you have that COE lead. This slide breaks down a little bit more on in that more centralized role. If you have multiple roles within your central level, what kind of roles might you think about? So someone who leads more on like the strategic side. Sometimes we have program managers in there who act as program and project managers, and they may help sites deploy, like manage the project, think about what hardware they need to buy, make sure the hardware gets in, make sure IT is set up correctly, internet is set up correctly, and facilitate the sites because the sites may not have resources. That's a role we sometimes see. More of a product manager, a technical role. And then solution lead, sometimes we have more technical experts, almost like solution architects involved with Tulip. And sometimes those are centralized. Again, this is company specific. So if you're thinking, hey, that doesn't make sense for my company, totally possible because it depends on how big you are, what roles already exist, and what resources you might have. And the last slide gets into detail on roles that we advocate for at the site level. I spoke about this briefly when I had the org structure slide up, and I am calling out again that quality and compliance, of course, need to be involved if you're doing anything that touches the actual process or that needs to be validated if you're in a regulated environment. So they would certainly need to be involved with the design of the apps, execution of building them, supporting sustainment of them. There's quite a bit that can go into this adoption program, different roles, different levels. Maybe that's a lot for where you're starting right now. Maybe you're just thinking about digital transformation and you are not ready to be able to dedicate resources or move people in organization structures. Fine, not a problem. So this slide is walking through from left to right here. We're just going chronologically. You don't need to start with a full-blown structure, especially if you're starting to deploy Tulip, say, one site, or even it's one use case across multiple sites. Start simpler. And we're going to talk about that. It's the same as Tulip app. Start simpler, iterate, and build onto them. You can start with a much simpler structure, and that's what that early stage left-hand side is trying to signal. Start with one person who is driving the change in more of a sponsorship type role. They are leading this concept of what may not be a COE or adoption program yet, but will become that. And they're going to need some site level input on app building, technical resourcing, and it can be light. As you scale up and start planning scale up, you can start adding layers and adding roles. So that's what that middle stage is showing. And this is an example, right? Do you need exactly the roles that are in that growth stage? It depends. You'll note there's an integration consultant role in that middle growth stage. And that is to highlight that depending on what resources you have in-house, maybe you may need to integrate multiple systems together. You maybe have external partners involved. Mature established COE, which is on the right-hand side, you can see a lot more roles and also more people in those roles. So at this point where you're probably every site has app builders. Maybe by this time you have a central team of app builders as well. They're ramped up. And I'll talk later about how to think about which apps or use cases might be central led or owned and which can be site led or owned. So why would you need app builders at both? We can get into that if folks are interested. So again, you don't need by any means to go build your full-blown COE today if you're just starting out with digital transformation or just starting to think about it. It's more about identifying that first maybe 2 to 3 key roles of who's going to be the technical person who drives the transformation. Do you have a leadership and sponsorship type role? And then stakeholders, but those folks are more relevant to any sort of project, whether it's digital or not. A couple ways to think about what can be site level versus central led. I'm going to refer back real quick to the slide I had where I talked about there's how to deploy and there's what to deploy. This slide is speaking to the what to deploy part. So on the technical Tulip apps, what apps should you actually build and how do you think about who owns what? A very common question we get across customers, especially those with larger, more enterprise organizations, is it makes them nervous to give citizen developers the option to go build Tulip apps however they like with whatever data structures they like, because there's a certain amount of oversight that IT, OT, whoever the team is likes to have. Great, that is totally fine, and by no means is Tulip trying to suggest that anyone should just be building whatever they want, wherever they want. This can be managed by process and by program. So this slide is just laying out a couple guidelines on how to think about what use cases might be centrally owned, meaning a central team has oversight of them, maybe owns the templates. Perhaps the central team even owns the version of the app. So the app is pushed to the sites and you're like, hey guys, we're on version 10. You need to be using that right now. And the right-hand side is a few thoughts on what sort of use cases can be site-led and site-driven, and they don't necessarily need anyone from a central team to review the design, the process, approve anything. Central deployment, complex apps. Complex versus simple, subjective. Again, this will get into what matters for your business. Does your business have existing programs to say, harmonize all your TPM processes? Okay, so maybe that needs to be a central led team because you've already got a team working on maintenance. There's also something to consider on integrations. A lot of companies, if you're doing a system integration, that has to involve certain folks from a central team, IT, OT, whatever it is. And those are things that can be written as guidelines for your adoption program of here's how to think about what's central led, here's how to think about what a site can own independently and just build and iterate on. A couple examples there, in site-specific cleaning checklists, process audits, some of that can be site-specific, and the guidance to a site is build whatever you need. We don't need to run it by anyone through central. So we're going to keep going now with one more slide on this centralized, less centralized concept, but this one is going to be focused on validation. So for those of you who are in GXP environments, primarily life sciences, some thoughts on how to think about if you're less centralized or more centralized, who does what relative to quality management and validation. And the difference is this one is structured vertically instead of horizontally, but more centralized is on top, less centralized is on the bottom. A couple basic things that are going to happen are supplier management activities and then your validation plan. In a more centralized organization, supplier management might be done and managed solely by the central team as far as auditing Tulip. Tulip has our standard documentation we can provide to support audits and doing, say, if there's a quality agreement, supplier questionnaires, those are usually owned centrally. That way we don't have to do them, say, for every site since it's usually redundant. In a less centralized or maybe smaller organization, you may or may not need to audit Tulip, but that gets done. For the validation master plan, a more centralized organization might be creating guidance that goes out to all the sites. So for example, defining what features all apps need to be using. E-signature. E-signature needs to be used for only, or maybe not only, but for all critical to quality parameters inputted into your batch record. E-signature is required. There's probably already an SOP about that. Great. So all of that comes from central. Describing global functionality that comes out of the audit. So when we talk about global functionality, Tulip as a platform comes with certain functionality. That functionality is configured to make the apps work, and the apps are business process specific. So if there's certain functionality that's been audited, verified, part of Tulip as a qualified platform, those are typically things that sites don't need to do because they're already qualified and validated. And we talk about, for those, especially customers have probably heard this from Tulip, validating Tulip apps based on the business process and intended use of the app. And then if there's global procedural content management, such as approval processes, Tulip has built-in approval processes for apps. So if you were to say modify an app and want to release it to end users, you can set up an approval workflow. And that workflow may need to include, someone from quality, maybe somebody from a different team. And if there's a global procedure for that, a central team could own that. There's obviously quite a variation in how much of that you need depending on your company. And then hopefully you're all validated and you can go live in operational phase. So LCM is lifecycle management. There's app lifecycle management, versions of the app, and then platform being versions of Tulip. So which release or version of Tulip are you on? How do you manage that change? So hopefully that all makes sense to folks. And again, this slide was more focused on people in GXP and regulated environments. So if you're not in that environment, a lot of what I said may not be relevant to you. This next slide is a quick view of app lifecycle management in an app. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because this is getting into a lot more technical governance on, if you remember I call it the 4 bubble slide earlier with the 4 parts of governance that we were going to talk about. We're very much in the bottom right of platform and content governance. So this is app lifecycle. Tulip apps have the ability to be versioned. So there's a lot of change management that you can do to manage within the platform itself. And this is what I was referring to on the previous slide as far as quality, compliance, how involved they are with app lifecycle and approvals can vary by company, degree of centralization, what teams you already have. So that was a lot of talking. What I'm going to do now is I've got a couple slides that I would like to facilitate a thought exercise for y'all on how would you start thinking about or putting together your adoption program. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the slides, run through some of the topics, and then just be quiet for a bit. And hopefully you're able to write some thoughts down, piece of paper, grab a notebook. All right, so this is the workshop portion. I'm building your COE for digital transformation. The little framework I've got above on plan, operationalize, and evolve. The planning stage is just more laying out what do you need to do? What do you need to think about? Operationalize is starting to put the pieces in place and execute. And evolve is more of the continuous improvement bit. It also goes to the slide I mentioned earlier where your adoption program or center of excellence should grow and evolve over time. You don't need to start with every role in place. That's also all in the evolve phase. So where you start does not need to be where you end up, say, a year or 2 years from now. So the 2 areas I want to talk about for how to plan, and this is where I would like y'all to start thinking about this for your own company. Where are you today, and what would you need to do to be successful? How ready is your organization for change? So I've got a couple bullets on just things trigger thoughts, culture and mindsets. Are people open to change? Are they open maybe in certain areas, certain functions, certain sites? What is their mindset around digital? Are they wary of new tools? Do they trust data? Familiarity with cloud-based solutions. There's some things to think about there. The next one is on organizational structures, teams, and talent. How centralized are you today? What shared services exist? Example, finance, typically a shared service. Procurement, typically a shared service. Do you have very strong quality teams at the site level? Is it all central? Is there nothing in central? All right, so where are your roles? Where are the people today? How do you usually communicate? How do you get to leadership? We talked about for COE and digital transformation, how important it is to have stakeholders and sponsorship. How are those folks? How are you going to get in touch with them? How are you going to run a steering meeting? And then processes, systems, and data. And I've got that call out down. I know that digital transformation seeks to improve and change processes, systems, and data, but understanding what your current state is important. So just a thought on who are you going to pull in? Does IT own everything? Do you not have an OT? Who needs to be involved might be informed by your current state. And then roles and capabilities. I've covered a bit in the previous one as far as getting more specific about who might be a good person or a few good people to get involved with digital transformation, who can talk about change, is open to change, can help advocate for it, can help see a bigger picture of how change drives value to the business. And I know I've said that a couple of times, but very tactically, that can be things like improving first pass yield, improving cycle times so you can get more throughput out every shift. It can be very tactical in that sense, but like they can think about these concepts. And then do you have gaps in roles or skill sets? So maybe you already are aware that you have certain folks at one site, maybe no one is really great with digital tools, and that's going to be a site that's harder to deploy at. So great, jot that down. I'm going to be quiet for a moment, let people think about that, and then we've got one more slide with a similar list of questions. All right, it's been about 1 minute. You can always come back to this, and hopefully you will, because you're thinking about how to set up an adoption program. Next similar slide is when you start to operationalize this, how will it actually work? So now we're going to skip ahead and pretend you've identified a few folks. You have someone who's going to be, say, at the site level, a change agent, someone who's an early adopter of new tools, and maybe at the central level, through either ops excellence, advanced manufacturing, or an IT team, you have someone who can own Tulip as a system and as a product, like a new digital product that you're bringing into your company. So you have at least those two folks identified, and then stakeholders as far as who in quality needs to be involved, the plant manager of the site or operations lead. You've got them identified. Now a couple questions on how would this organization make decisions? I bring this up because one of the first things I mentioned about centers of excellence are they're here to drive change, which means they're going to do things differently, or they're going to drive the business to do things differently than they do today. So if that's true, they may need to have access to leadership to make decisions or get input on things at a rate or in a way that is not typical for day-to-day operations. So some companies I've seen already have a steering committee concept for, say, new projects or pilots in place. They've got a monthly forum and every project out there gets a 15-minute slot. Okay, great. You've already got something. But if you don't have that, how can you convene the right people? The second bullet under decision making on how you'll think about use cases is that slide I mentioned earlier, what we looked at earlier, where it had what use cases might be owned at the site level and what might be owned by central teams. Are there initial thoughts on some obvious ones? Again, if your company is already working on harmonizing certain processes, I mentioned total productive maintenance, TPM, earlier, because this was actually a customer where they had a central team working to harmonize those processes and best practices across all their sites already. So that was a clear case for the apps that support those use cases. The Tulip apps would have oversight by a central team. So what's already going on in your company? What initiatives exist? And on measurements, we always want to know, how will you know this is working or not? What can you measure? What are you going to try to be able to see? Is it feedback from the steering committee? Is it being able to bring certain content there? Number of citizen developers who are active in the Tulip instance each month I've mentioned. Approval process. You want to make, if you have, say, procedures for content management on Tulip, adherence to those procedures. Similarly, just going to let y'all think for a minute, hopefully jot a few notes down, and then we'll go through a couple examples of how other customers have structured their adoption programs. Okay. Gonna come back. Again, not a lot of time, but hopefully these questions are spurring some thoughts on how you can start setting up an adoption program, a center of excellence, and making it run more smoothly. I've got a couple of examples also a template that people can try to use for how you might try to sketch out who you need in what roles. And then I have some customer examples of their adoption programs. So this is a template, nothing fancy about it. Feel free to, if anyone wants to look at it and adopt it for how their structures are, fine. But it follows that same 3 vertical sections that I showed earlier from an org structure standpoint, as far as having executive sponsors, a central team, and then site level folks, right? And then the colors are just what do you currently have in place, and then what are gaps, roles that you don't have in place that you would like to have in place. A few examples, and one thing I like about this one is they clearly have gaps, and this customer has been deploying Tulip very well across multiple sites, and they have gaps, right? So to that earlier slide on, you don't need to have everything in place today. This, if anything, is a tool to help you understand where do we want to get to? Okay, I don't have a quality sponsor. We can't get into the quality use cases, or it would be better if we got these approvals through quality. That's great to identify because at least now it's known by everyone. They have a central IT team, and then this particular company is working pretty closely with the Tulip team. More on the pharmaceutical side. This one, less about highlighting gaps, and that, as you can see by the number of bullets, they have quite a few people involved. Could we find gaps? Probably. But for this company, they were quite organized in that they already have this concept of an executive steering committee, and they have it in place for how they were going to manage Tulip, in this case, as an MES deployment. So that was in place. There was a really good sponsorship. And there was multiple parties involved from the external side, as far as other vendors, Tulip and other software vendors working with these teams to deploy, because this was full digital transformation. There's multiple systems involved. Tulip is being integrated to other systems. So there's quite a few people involved. This one has 4 levels in that they've got that integration development layer in there, which is purely technical on system integration, data structures. In this case, for those of you who are more technical, setting up APIs, figuring out the data structure so that systems can communicate back and forth. So they had a much more technical layer in there. And I feel like that's a great example for companies who have or are thinking about that level of technicality in the system setup. And then I've got one more, also in the life sciences space. Again, this one is that structure where we're highlighting gaps. Central quality is a gap, but they had site level quality involved. So this is how we're able to still deploy certain GXP use cases. And then also in this case, Tulip was owned by an operations tech, so the OT team, less by operations themselves. And I think we've seen across the board, whether Tulip ownership at the central level is operations, IT, OT, it can work depending on your company, but you're going to want those groups involved regardless of who has ownership. So it really depends on how your company is structured and who owns systems, who works with them. In this case, the OT team was very, very heavily involved, but of course we still have site level SMEs involved to be able to support the details, the processes, getting feedback and information on the apps from folks. And then as we're looking to scale up with this customer, they were identifying that at some of the other sites, the operations managers actually weren't involved enough, or they weren't quite part of the adoption program as far as understanding the vision for Tulip and being able to identify use cases and priorities. So that was something that we were going to go work on as far as scale up planning goes. With that, thank you, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful in how to think about setting up an adoption program for digital transformation and defining your center of excellence. Hopefully you have some thoughts on how to identify folks and what gaps you might have. And I want to wish you all a great rest of the Ops Calling.